You're listening to Soundside. I'm Paige Browning.
Effective immediately, we're repealing the ridiculous endangerment finding and terminating all additional green emission standards imposed unnecessarily on vehicle models and engines between 2012 and 2027 and beyond.
That was President Trump speaking last Thursday when he announced he was overturning the Environmental Protection Agency's endangerment finding. That finding is a scientific conclusion signed by the EPA in 2009. It determined that greenhouse gases are harmful to people and the environment, and it allowed the EPA to regulate heat-trapping emissions like carbon dioxide and methane. The current presidential administration says climate change is a hoax and that environmental regulations hinder the economy. Current EPA head Lee Zeldin is praising the move by Trump.
The Obama and Biden administrations used it to steamroll into existence a left-wing wish list of costly climate policies, electric vehicle mandates, and other requirements that assaulted consumer choice and affordability.
Environmental activists and Democratic lawmakers took no time to denounce the decision, saying it will harm public health and lead to intensifying climate change-related catastrophes such as wildfires, heat waves, and flooding. And of course, there's a court challenge. California Governor Gavin Newsom stated California intends to sue the federal government over this change, potentially leading to a drawn-out, years-long battle to determine what the EPA can and cannot do when it comes to greenhouse gas regulation. Washington's Attorney General Nick Brown has promised something similar in the courts. But what exactly was this scientific finding that the president repealed? And how could its repeal change climate science and policy in the United States? Here to discuss is David Battisti, professor of atmospheric and climate science and Tamaki Endowed Chair at the University of Washington. He also has written in favor of the endangerment finding. Professor Battisti, great to have you here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Just to start, I'm hoping to make this simple to understand for people listening and for me, frankly. But these two words, endangerment finding, are the crux of this major move by Trump. What does the endangerment finding do in practice?
The endangerment finding, it requires the government to regulate the pollutants. So the Supreme Court case in 2007 decided, based on the science, that carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act was a pollutant, and the EPA had to evaluate whether or not to regulate it. And then 2 years later, the EPA decides that they are going to regulate it because under the Clean Air Act, anything that endangers humans or human welfare, and included in the legal definition of welfare is climate, anything that endangers human welfare in the United States, they have to regulate. So there's many things the EPA regulates that wasn't originally in the Clean Air Act because it fits under the Clean Air Act. For example, CFCs were not there, but we regulate CFCs for the ozone hole.
That's interesting. So it started with this Supreme Court case in 2007, as you mentioned. That was Massachusetts versus EPA.
Right.
And then after that case, the EPA decided, now we need to regulate that because it's causing harm. At issue was whether the EPA was required to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, which it then decided to do. But you got involved with this. You were a co-author on an amicus brief for the case, arguing that greenhouse gases could be regulated by the EPA. What was your argument?
We actually, what we argued was that the science was sound, that linked carbon dioxide to climate change, and then from climate change to human welfare. That's what we argued. We didn't actually say they have to regulate. We just said that the science is solid. It's just as solid as anything else you've decided to make a regulation for, like lead in gasoline, for example. And so we just argued that they have to accept the science, and under the science, carbon dioxide is a pollutant.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what you were arguing there? You said that you basically had argued this science is sound. What did that science say? And this is back in 2007?
Yes, but you have to go way back. You have to go back 130 years and say, when did we first know that the climate would change if we increase carbon dioxide? And that was 130 years ago. And the answer today is not that different than it was 130 years ago. And for the last 40 years, we've done a lot of studies with better data, better models, and the answer is pretty much the same. In fact, every year we just get more and more certain about what's going to happen. And so when you look at the science today compared to the science in 2009, when this EPA ruling happened, was solid. And the science today is even more certain than it was in 2016.
And last year, you and your colleagues from that original amicus brief put out a new paper on how your arguments had stood up, just what you're saying. What did you find?
So all the projections that we had have come true for the last 16 years. They were right on schedule for given these emissions, what should the climate do? So 12 of the last 16 years have been the warmest years on record. The ocean continues to acidify and warm. We are having more record. The frequency of hot day records is increasing, and the frequency of cold day records is decreasing. All these things were anticipated, even quantitatively, as this rolled out. So, there's new science that actually reduces the uncertainty in the future. The big uncertainty is how much carbon dioxide are we going to put in the atmosphere. But the science is becoming more sound every year. Like if we know how much CO2 is, we're more certain today than we were 16 years ago. And the projections that were used to make that endangerment finding were not the most extreme projections as the administration tried to argue back last summer.
Oh, there were more extreme projections out there, or more.
There's the scientists do the right thing. They look at all possibilities. So we couldn't, not me, but the scientific community, you can't say exactly what the emission scenario is going to be. So you have to use different ones to say what would happen.
Here's a conservative guess.
That's right.
Or estimate.
So you have like a business as usual, which is kind of the high end. And then you have assuming that there's governance and there's switch to renewables and things like that, which is kind of the middle of the road. That's kind of the Paris Protocol, actually. And then there's the kind of utopia where we have this magical ability to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which we don't have today, and there's no indication we are going to have it in the next couple of decades. So the decision was based on that. It was based on kind of mainstream, not extreme science, but mainstream science. And that's what's happened.
And you've said, and as you and your colleagues wrote, this science has stood up for 16 years. What will change now that the endangerment finding has been, ripped up, basically repealed? Right.
So first, the one point here is that it's not legal to do this unless you abolish the Clean Air Act. Under the Clean Air Act, they have to regulate carbon dioxide because there's a clear link between increasing greenhouse gases emissions in the United States. For every molecule of CO2 we emit in the United States, it goes into the atmosphere and it warms the climate. Everybody else is warming the climate too, but we do warm the climate and it hurts American citizens in American citizens' welfare. So it's illegal to change it. But that doesn't stop.
Yeah, and they're changing it and arguing that it's overblown. That the health findings are overblown and it's a hoax. So that's what's coming from the presidential administration, and they did repeal it. So what happens now?
So what happens in the repeal? If they're successful, through the court process, if they're successful, what happens is that there's no obligation for the government to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. That's the main thing. And so if you look at, for example, petroleum is used mostly by transportation, and it's been pretty much level for the last 16 years. But before that ruling, it was going up and up and up for almost 40 years. Just regularly. And so some of the leveling off of CO2 emissions, not all of it, but some of it is due to those regulations. So you take the regulations away and CO2 emissions are bound to go up. Probably more important thing is it's going to be more and more difficult to invest in renewable energy and to make that transition.
Last week, Doug Burgum, the United States Interior Secretary, told Fox Business that, quote, CO2 was never a pollutant. When we breathe, we emit CO2. Plants need CO2 to survive and grow. They thrive with more CO2. What does that tell you about that argument tell you about how the current administration views climate science and now policy? You're laughing, of course, at this CO2 was never a pollutant.
Yeah, this was a commercial back, 15 years ago that was put out by one of these conservative think tanks. And look at it this way. CO2 is a food for plants. Okay, it's a food for crops. It's also true that if you put CO2 in the atmosphere, the atmosphere heats up. That's not necessarily a good thing for plants or crops. And all the science that we've seen so far is that if you grow crops under the increased temperature that comes with increasing CO2, is that the temperature wins and the crop yield goes down. Mm-hmm. So this is like this argument just doesn't hold water. I mean, but water is a good example. Water is not a pollutant. It's great. Too much water, you drown. Right? And so it's the same kind of idea. You can't look at it in isolation. This sort of argument is like, if my 5-year-old grandson said this, I would laugh. It would be funny. But coming from an adult, this is not funny.
It says a lot about the current administration's views. Lee Zeldin, who's the head of the EPA now, said last week that the endangerment finding creates unnecessary regulatory burdens and hurts consumers. And he anticipates that the price of cars will go down for American families. In your mind, is there any value in repealing the endangerment finding?
No. If you look in isolation, maybe the price of cars does come down by the $2,400 they claim. There's actually no evidence they provided for us to agree with that number. But we do know from independent things that the subsidies that directly and indirectly that the fossil fuel industry gets is way more than is about $3,000 a year, not per car that you buy. So if you buy a car every 10 years, you're out $2,400. But every year, you and I are out $3,000 because of the direct and indirect subsidies. So, it's not about saving the consumer money. This is just about protecting, fossil fuel interests.
And do you believe your brief and the subsequent endangerment finding have been misused when it comes to regulation policy?
No, because the brief was argued from the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court accepted the science and said to the EPA, no, CO2 is a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. So that is the law of the land right now. So the EPA can't decide CO2 is not a pollutant. Under the Clean Air Act, it is. The Supreme Court said that.
And this is not the only action the Trump administration has taken regarding climate change policy or research. I'm wondering how your work has changed in, let's just say, the last year. For example, have you had to change your research due to federal policy changes or funding cuts by the Trump administration?
So funding has, for example, grants that were accepted, that funding often didn't come through. So even though the grant was accepted, the funding didn't come through. There's been a lot of slowdown in the funding that's come out. They've done a pretty good job of trying to scrub climate from all mention in the National Science Foundation and in the Department of Energy. So people are relabeling things. And there's a real effort to take the leading Center for Climate Research in the United States, which is a government facility that serves all of climate scientists in the U.S. and internationally. There's a real effort to scrub climate totally from that institution and make it just a weather institution.
Is there anything in your research that, or colleagues that people have been wanting to research, and you're waiting for that funding? It's just trickling in?
Well, in some cases, the funding's stopped. They just stopped funding things. It was maybe in the middle of a 2 or 3 year grant, and the funding just said, "Okay, we're done. We're not going to do it." And so yes, it's hurt a lot of people. It's cost some people some jobs, especially NOAA, and it's got a lot of students that would normally come to the United States or who are in the United States who want to go into science. It's made them think twice, not just about climate science, but a lot of science, because this administration is really anti-science, period.
Yeah. Is there anything else you think people should understand when it comes to last week's action by President Trump on climate?
I would say the important thing to understand is, in some sense, the regulations that the United States put into place was just the stepping stone. I mean, if you really want to solve climate change, it's regulations, it's emissions by all countries. And the amount of regulation you need to do to stabilize climate is way more than what the EPA had been doing.
That was just the starting point.
That was just the starting point, yeah.
Professor Battisti, where will we be at the end of this century? Can you give us a broad view of how you're viewing climate as we move forward?
Yeah, I can. I won't be around at the end of the century, but I can tell you where we're headed, basically. The global emissions of greenhouse gases have actually increased by about 13% since 2016. And the U.S. emissions have actually gone down a little bit. Like I said, for reasons where we've had regulations, it's, kind of helped. Mm-hmm. It's not the only reason. We've switched from, some cases, oil and coal to natural gas, which for the same amount of energy gives you less CO2 emissions. So that was good.
We've actually taken steps to reduce climate emissions.
We have.
Fractionally.
That's right. And in some cases, that still transportation is still a big fraction of the total U.S. emissions. And we've made some headway because of the regulations, which are now going away. So those will probably start to increase again. So we're on course right now. If we think that everybody else is going to regulate, and we're eventually going to, in the U.S., people will shift to renewable energy because it's cheaper than fossil fuels. I mean, that's just going to be something that no administration is going to stop. It's just going to be slower now that there's no kind of regulation. But if we're on course right now, and realistically, by the time my grandchildren are my age, we'll be about 5 degrees Fahrenheit above normal, above today.
Fahrenheit.
Every 5 degrees every day in and day out. And that's for the global average. Now, we've known this for at least 40 years, that land warms more than ocean. So when you say the global average is going to be 5 degrees Fahrenheit more than today, the land, if you live over the land, which of course everybody does, it's 7 degrees Fahrenheit. So just think of every day of your life, 7 degrees warmer on average.
85-degree day becomes 92.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it changes pretty much everything. And it's a different world than any humans have actually experienced. At least if you're in your place in space. Obviously, if you live in the tropics, it's always warmer. But if you in your place in space, it's going to be a different world in all sorts of ways. Like the impacts, easiest to understand is increased heat stress everywhere. But places that don't see real serious heat stress today will see heat stress when my grandkids are my age. A decrease in crop yields, increased disease transmission rates because disease transmission rates go with temperature. It's a very basic biological thing. Increased forest fires, as we've been seeing already. That will just keep on going up until we actually don't have any forest to burn anymore. So there's a lot of things like that you can project, and there's very little uncertainty in this. So you can't be wrong on the sign.
Can we end on a positive or at least a neutral note? Is there something that gives you hope when it comes to the climate crisis?
I think what gives me hope is the renewable energy has increased. The use of renewable energy, even in the United States, has increased tremendously. And even though this administration thinks climate change is a hoax, the Pew surveys year after year after year, overwhelmingly Americans understand climate is a problem. Climate change is a problem, and they believe in the science. So I mean, it's a convenient thing if you don't want regulation, if you want to protect the people who have power now to say climate change is a hoax. But most Americans don't believe that, and certainly the science is the science, and you can't make it go away.
Okay, we have to end it there. David Battisti is professor of atmospheric and climate science and Tamaki Endowed Chair at the University of Washington Department of Atmospheric and Climate Science. Professor Battisti, thank you so much for explaining this and for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You're listening to Soundside. I'm Paige Browning, and we're discussing last week's announcement by President Trump that he's repealing a key scientific finding that allows the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. When we come back, what this means for climate policy here in Washington. That's in just a minute, right here on KUOW. You're listening to Soundside. I'm Paige Browning. Today on the show, the future of climate regulation in Washington state and nationwide. Last week, President Trump overturned the Environmental Protection Agency's endangerment finding, which in 2009 determined that greenhouse gases are harmful to people and the environment. Before the break, we discussed what that finding is and its impact nationwide. Now we're turning to Washington state. We're known for being at the vanguard of climate regulation, so we're calling up the guy once dubbed the greenest governor in the country to take the temperature with us. Jay Inslee is the former governor of Washington state. Governor Inslee, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. Pretty important subject today.
Yes, I agree. And the last time we spoke to you, this was just a proposal by the Trump administration, and now it's come to pass. So let's get right to the point here. What does the president's decision to overturn the endangerment clause mean for Washington state?
Well, to start with, in some sense, it means nothing because it's illegal. And I think it is a considerable probability it will be found illegal, like so many of his other illegal actions. This is a guy who tears up the law and the Constitution every morning before he has breakfast. His narcissism and his sociopathic tendencies are now on full display, and it is not a surprise. He said he was going to do this, so there's no shock about this. And there should not be shock when the courts throw this mean-spirited, idiotic, non-scientific, flat Earth society climate denial out the window. And I think that he asked the professor what gives him hope. That's one of the things that gives us hope. The law requires the federal government to protect us from this noxious pollution. And that should give us hope to start with. Listen, you got to understand, they actually gave up their argument on this. And not many people are aware of this. But Trump has been saying that climate change is a hoax. Mm-hmm. They actually gave up that argument. They tried to make it, and they gave it up because they knew they would be laughed out of court. Their present argument is that the federal government cannot protect us except maybe within 100 yards of the smokestack,
right,
which is just ridiculous. I mean, if somebody puts arsenic in the reservoir in Seattle and hurts people 5 miles away in a pipeline, they'd argue that nobody can regulate that. It's just an asinine argument.
Yeah.
So the first thing we ought to give a hope that this thing gets thrown out. But the second is we can continue our efforts here in the state of Washington.
Yeah. That was part of their, thank you for your answer there. And that was part of their argument that it's just too far downstream to prove that methane pollution over here in this smokestack is causing harm to me as a person. The New York Times reports that several businesses told the EPA that they were concerned that repealing federal oversight on greenhouse gas emissions, like has been done, would force companies to follow like a patchwork of local laws around emissions. And now it seems like that could become the case. Does that impact how Washington state can work with companies to lower their greenhouse gas emissions, or maybe how amenable companies will be to following state environmental laws?
Well, yes, and it's good news, and this is really good news, is that our state has the ability constitutionally to control, to a large part, our own destiny in this realm. So we have the ability to pass and protect a cap and invest bill, as the voters did 62 to 38. We have the ability to have some of the best building code standards in the United States. We have the ability to have 100% requirement that the grid become clean in the decades to come. We have the ability to put in charging stations and electric buses and get people heat pumps. All of these things are within our jurisdiction. And the good news is Donald Trump cannot stop us, by and large, from doing these things. The one thing that is troublesome is in our car efficiency standards. There will be litigation about that. I hope we will prevail. But probably 80% of the things that anyone would want to do on carbon reduction, we can do under our own control of our own destiny. And that's good news in our state. I'm very proud of our state. I've been living here pretty much my whole life, still do get to live in Kitsap County right now.
Yeah.
And we want to protect this place. And by the way, this is not some ephemeral, hypothetical issue in the future. This is a situation today. For Donald Trump to say that this is a hoax, go tell him that the people had 2 feet of mud in their home during the floods last month. Go tell the people of Malden and Medical Lake, 2 towns that actually burned down. 85% of the buildings in Malden burned down. 2 catastrophic fires while I was governor. This is a thing people are suffering today. All of the kelp has disappeared in Kitsap County because our waters are becoming too hot for bull kelp to survive. So this is not something that just our grandchildren will recognize. It's something we're recognizing today. But good news is Washington's moving forward. I'm very proud of our state, and I'm proud of working with the companies in our state, which are building businesses. Look, we just got permitting for the largest pump storage facility over in Golden Ale in the Western Hemisphere. We just got permits for one of the largest wind turbines and solar panel manufacturing, developments over in southeastern Washington. So we've got a lot of business activity, job creation associated with this. And guess what? This electricity is cheaper than coal-based electricity. And this is one of the things that gets my goat. Trump came in saying he was going to reduce costs, but he's trying to shove coal-powered electricity down our throats, including in Centralia. We want to close this plant so we can get cheaper renewable energy. He's trying to force the citizens of Washington State to pay more for electricity for old, expensive, dirty coal-fired electricity, which is just nuts. So I'm glad we've got a state that wants to move forward.
Yeah, and I want to ask you, because I want to understand what more Washington State can or may do, and I'll just let listeners know the plant you're talking about, a long-time coal-fired power plant that is closed, but the Trump administration would like to prevent it from becoming, would like to keep it operational in the future, at least prevent it from becoming a alternative energy source. And I want to ask you a little bit more about the endangerment finding and just kind of how we got here. Lee Zeldin, who's the current head of the EPA, stated that the endangerment finding had been used to push a left-wing wish list. Another conservative research group said if Congress thinks the EPA should regulate CO2 as a pollutant, then they should say so affirmatively in law so the EPA has a clear mandate. The EPA regulated greenhouse gases because of a Supreme Court case, not because of Congress. Do you think that was the right approach, or is it necessary for Congress to step in?
Congress has stepped in. They passed the Clean Air Act that does mandate that these gases be regulated. Your previous professor gave the entirely scientifically accurate conclusion that what Congress did is it says that gases that are harmful to the general health and welfare, this has been shown by science and health umpteen times. It's been known and required by the law passed by Congress since 2007, and the endangerment finding was issued in 2009 because the science requires it. So that is totally a bogus argument and a dangerous one as well. Now, you got to understand, why are they making this fallacious argument? Well, look, this is just a payoff that's going on right now. It's a payoff because the coal industry, the fossil fuel industry, went to Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and I'm not making this up, it's pretty much been validated, and it basically said, he said, look, give me $1 billion to my electoral campaign, and I'll take care of your competition. I'll shut down your competition. I'll shut down solar and wind. I'll shut down any regulations that give people cleaner air. This is the second part of that dance where he's doing the payoff. He got the hundreds of millions of dollars, and now you're witnessing the payoff. And I don't understand this thing about, well, somehow this is a left-wing issue. Look, when I went to Malden, this is a town in eastern Washington that burned down in the fire, the Babb Road fire a few years ago.
Yep.
Even the firehouse burned down. I went over there to meet with the people, and their homes are all burned down. Guess what? Many of them had Trump signs in their front yard. The people who are suffering aren't left, right, center, up, down, green, blue, or red. They're people whose houses have been burned to the ground because we are now having probably a doubling of the frequency of very intense wildfires. And the science is very clear on this, that it's attributable to this pollution and the climate change. So I'll tell you what, when I go to these disaster scenes, as I have with floods and fires, I don't see Republicans or Democrats, right or left. I see people who deserve to have a federal government who will protect them, and thankfully have a state government to protect them from the onslaught of these disasters. And when you get a new job, when your kid gets a new job in a clean energy industry, I got a friend whose son just got a job working for a clean tech company. You're proud of them whether you're Democrat or Republican, and that's happening across the state. And when you get an electrical bill that's less than coal, you're really happy about that.
Yeah,
and
Governor.
It's just incredible that Trump's now trying to shove this down our throats.
And that is something that his supporters have said during this is, this is going to make cars cheaper for the American public, as the professor and I just spoke about. But Governor, I want to get a little bit more local, talking about Washington State. I'm wondering if I'm seeing an about face to some extent. You were known as the greenest governor. The Climate Commitment Act was a signature piece of legislation during your tenure. And now our state's lawmakers are actually this week considering taking money from the state's main climate account, kind of reaching into the climate cookie jar. State House Majority Leader Joe Fitzgibbon told the Seattle Times recently lawmakers are planning to take $500 million from carbon auction money and use it to pay down the state's budget gap. Your successor, Governor Bob Ferguson, supports this. It's legal, but the money was meant to go towards projects that mitigate the impacts of climate change. So I'm wondering, do you see Washington State backing away from being a climate leader as it once aimed to be? Now that you're no longer governor, are policies moving away from the environment?
Well, no, we'll still be a leader even if there is a disappointing budget conclusion. And the reason is we have not just the cap and invest bill, it will remain in place, and it has generated over $4 billion that are helping Washingtonians get clean energy technologies. We'll still have the 100% clean bill. We'll still have a low carbon fuel standard. We'll still have the best building code efficiencies in the country. So we'll still be in the lead in the nation. But I am hopeful that this does not happen. It would be a disappointment because people did vote for this, for making these investments by, 62-38. Talk about a landslide. I certainly never got 62%.
Oh, that was the vote split. 62, yes.
Correct.
30, yeah.
So it was a huge outpouring of support from this mission statement. And I don't think that it is the appropriate purpose of these dollars. It was not meant to be the reserve fund for the general fund. It was meant to advance climate purposes. And there are many, many other options to solve what is a challenging time. I'm happy that I hope legislators will rethink this because they just got about $500 million extra bump in the revenue forecast that might ease some of their burdens. So I'm hopeful that this is preserved by and large, because I think Washingtonians have made it very clear that they want to see progress on this. They're experiencing progress and success on this, and we ought to continue on that mission statement.
And I want to ask you more about what Washington can do. We have about a minute left. I wish I had more time, but I want to make sure I can ask, Governor, what can states do, individually or together, to take on the climate crisis? Let's assume the federal government, certainly under Trump, says, we're not doing this anymore. This is not a priority. We're ripping up the endangerment finding. Are we bound to see states teaming up to form their own pollution plans and more?
Well, actually, we are doing that. I actually founded an organization to that end. It's called the U.S. Climate Alliance.
Right.
It now has 23 states who act in as much concert as possible to advance these climate policies. We are a leading state in that. We are trying to encourage and work with other states to join us. New York, for instance, is considering a cap and invest bill. Other states are considering our building efficiencies. So we are acting as a leader to move forward with the U.S. Climate Alliance. And I'm proud of that organization because maybe it foreshadowed the arrival of Trump to realizing that we need to seek our own destiny, our own path, and seize control of our own future. And we are doing that. And I know every entity, every person, every business has a role in this. It doesn't matter who you are. You don't have to be governor or legislator on this. All of us can play a role on this, by the way, including voting. So we can all be part of this great mission.
We'll have to leave it there. Jay Inslee is the former governor of Washington State. Governor Inslee, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Beth. We'll talk again, I hope.
I hope so.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime right here online at KUOW.org, or of course on your favorite podcast app.